Marcus Thompson stood in his marble-floored foyer, his expensive leather briefcase still gripped tightly in his manicured hand. The 42-year-old tech mogul had built his empire from nothing, turning a small software company into a billion-dollar corporation that employed thousands. His mansion in the hills of Beverly Hills was a testament to his success, with its sprawling gardens, infinity pool, and rooms that most people could only dream of seeing in magazines. But success had come at a price. Marcus barely saw his 8-year-old twins, Emma and Ethan, anymore. Between board meetings in New York, conferences in Tokyo, and deals closing in London, he had become a stranger in his own home. His wife Sarah had left him 2 years ago, taking nothing but her dignity and leaving the children because she knew Marcus could provide them with the best education and opportunities money could buy. What she couldn't provide was her constant presence, something Marcus seemed incapable of offering. The house felt different today as he walked through the grand hallway. He had cut his business trip to Singapore short after closing a major deal ahead of schedule. Something had been nagging at him during the long flight home, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way Emma had sounded distant during their last video call, or how Ethan had barely looked up from his tablet to say goodbye before Marcus left for the airport 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper, had texted him that morning, saying she would be visiting her sick mother and wouldn't return until evening. Marcus had forgotten that his regular nanny, Janet, was also away on her scheduled vacation. He assumed his children would be with the backup childcare service he kept on retainer, though he realized with a stab of guilt that he wasn't entirely sure who that was anymore. The sound of laughter drifted from the direction of the kitchen, warm and genuine in a way that made Marcus pause. It had been so long since he'd heard his children laugh like that. He set down his briefcase quietly and followed the sound, his Italian leather shoes silent on the polished hardwood floors. As he approached the kitchen, he could hear a woman's voice, rich and melodious, speaking in a way that commanded attention without demanding it. She was telling a story, her voice rising and falling with dramatic flair that had both children completely captivated. Marcus found himself drawn forward, curious about who this person was and why his normally reserved children sounded so engaged. The kitchen was a chef's dream, with granite countertops, state-of-the-art appliances, and a center island large enough to seat 8 people comfortably. It was here that Marcus stopped short, his breath catching in his throat at the scene before him. A black woman in her 50s sat on one of the bar stools, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She wore a simple blue dress and comfortable shoes, but there was something regal about her posture, something commanding about the way she held herself. Emma and Ethan sat across from her, their eyes wide with fascination as she gestured expressively with her hands. But it wasn't just the woman's presence that made Marcus freeze. It was what she was teaching his children. Spread across the granite countertop were books Marcus had never seen before. Not the expensive educational materials he had purchased from the most exclusive publishers. Not the tablets loaded with the latest learning apps, but worn, well-loved books with cracked spines and pages that had clearly been turned by many eager hands. The woman held up a photograph, and Marcus could see it was old, black and white, showing people in clothes from decades past. She was pointing to different faces in the picture, and as Marcus listened more carefully, he realized she was telling his children about history. But not the sanitized version they learned in their private school. She was telling them about real people, real struggles, real triumphs that had never made it into their textbooks. Emma leaned forward, her blonde hair falling across her face as she studied the photograph intently. "So they weren't allowed to go to the same schools as white children?" she asked, her voice small but filled with genuine curiosity. The woman nodded solemnly. "That's right, sweetheart. But you know what? Those children, they were just as smart, just as deserving, just as capable of learning as anyone else. And some very brave people fought to change those unfair laws." Ethan, who usually had trouble sitting still for more than 5 minutes, was hanging on every word. "Were you there?" he asked. "Did you see it happen?" The woman smiled, and there was something in that smile that spoke of wisdom earned through experience, of stories that deserved to be told. "I was just a little girl then, but yes, I remember. I remember when schools finally opened their doors to everyone. I remember the first day I walked into a classroom that had been all white just the day before." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that his children were learning something precious, something that all his money couldn't buy. They were learning empathy, They were learning about the real world, about people whose experiences were different from their privileged bubble. The woman continued her story, her voice painting pictures of courage and determination, of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. She spoke about children who had faced angry crowds just to go to school, about families who had risked everything for the chance at a better education for their sons and daughters. As Marcus watched, he saw his children in a way he had never seen them before, away from their tutors and structured activities, away from the pressure to excel in everything they touched. They were just two curious kids hungry for knowledge that meant something. They asked questions that showed they were really thinking, really trying to understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. The woman answered every question with patience and grace, never talking down to them, never making them feel silly for not knowing something. She treated them like the intelligent human beings they were, capable of understanding complex ideas and forming their own opinions. Marcus remained frozen in the doorway, afraid that if he moved, if he announced his presence, this magical moment would shatter. For the first time in months, maybe years, his children looked truly engaged, truly alive with curiosity and wonder. He began to wonder who this woman was, how she had come to be in his house, and why she was teaching his children lessons that were clearly more valuable than anything money could buy. But most of all, he wondered why he had never thought to teach them these things himself, and what other important lessons his children were missing in their carefully controlled, privileged world. The woman's name was Grace Washington, and as Marcus continued to listen from his hidden position, he learned that she had been sent by the emergency child care agency when their regular backup had canceled at the last minute. But Grace was clearly no ordinary babysitter. She spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through history, who had witnessed the moments that shaped the world his children were inheriting. Emma raised her small hand, just as she might in school. "Miss Grace, why didn't people want black children and white children to learn together? Wouldn't everyone be smarter if they could share ideas?" Grace's eyes lit up with approval at the question. "Oh, honey, that's exactly right. You see, some people were afraid. They had been told lies for so long that they started to believe them. They thought that keeping people separated would somehow make them more powerful, more special. But you know what the truth is?" Both children shook their heads, completely absorbed. The truth is that when people learn together, when they share their different ideas and experiences, everyone becomes stronger, like a garden with different kinds of flowers. Each one is beautiful on its own, but together they make something even more wonderful. Marcus felt a pang of recognition. In his business world, diversity wasn't just morally right, it was profitable. His most successful teams were the ones that brought together people from different backgrounds, different ways of thinking. Yet somehow he had never thought to teach his own children this fundamental truth. Grace pulled out another photograph, this one showing children of different races playing together in a schoolyard. This picture was taken at one of the first integrated schools in the South. See how happy these children look? They didn't care about the color of each other's skin. They just wanted to play and learn together. Ethan studied the photograph carefully. "They look like us when we play with our friends at school." "Exactly." Grace clapped her hands together. "Children understand what some grown-ups forget, that we're all just people, trying to learn and grow and be happy." Marcus thought about his children's elite private school, where diversity meant having students from different countries but all from wealthy families. His kids interacted with children from Japan, England, and Brazil. But how many of their classmates came from working-class families? How many had parents who cleaned offices or drove buses or worked in factories? Grace reached into a worn canvas bag and pulled out what appeared to be a handmade book, its pages held together with ribbon. "This is something very special," she said, her voice taking on a reverent tone. "This book was made by my grandmother, and her grandmother before that. It's filled with stories about our family, about the people who came before us." She opened the book carefully, revealing pages filled with handwritten text, pressed flowers, and more old photographs. Every family has stories like this, whether they're written down or just passed from person to person. Stories about where they came from, what they survived, what they hoped for. Emma leaned closer, fascinated by the handmade nature of the book. In her world, everything was digital, everything was purchased. The idea of something made by hand, passed down through generations, was completely foreign and utterly captivating. "My great-great-grandmother was born into slavery," Grace continued, her voice steady and strong. But she never let that define her. She learned to read in secret even though it was dangerous. She taught her children that education was the key to freedom, and that lesson has been passed down in our family ever since. Marcus felt his throat tighten. His own children had every educational advantage imaginable, tutors and private schools and opportunities most kids could only dream of. Yet they had never learned the most important lesson of all, that education was a privilege, something that people had died for, something that should never be taken for granted. What happened to her? Ethan asked quietly. After slavery ended, she started a small school in her church. She taught children whose parents had never been allowed to learn. She taught them to read and write, but she also taught them to be proud of who they were, to never let anyone make them feel small. Grace turned a page in the handmade book, revealing a photograph of a dignified woman in old-fashioned dress, her eyes fierce with determination. "That's her," Grace said simply. Her name was Sarah Washington. "She's the reason I became a teacher, and the reason I never forgot where I came from, no matter how far I traveled." Marcus realized that he knew almost nothing about his own family history beyond his grandparents. His children knew even less. They had never heard stories about ancestors who had struggled and sacrificed to give future generations a better life. They had no understanding of the weight of opportunity, the responsibility that came with privilege. Emma reached out to touch the photograph gently. "She looks strong." "She was," Grace nodded. "And you know what? You're strong too, both of you. But strength isn't just about having money or power. Real strength comes from understanding others, from caring about people who might be different from you, from using whatever gifts you have to make the world a little bit better." As Grace spoke, Marcus began to see his children differently, not as extensions of his success, not as projects to be managed and optimized, but as human beings with the capacity for empathy, wisdom, and genuine connection. He saw how hungry they were for meaning, for stories that mattered, for lessons that went beyond test scores and achievements. The conversation continued for another hour, with Grace sharing more photographs and stories, each one carefully chosen to teach a lesson about courage, kindness, or perseverance. She spoke about ordinary people who had done extraordinary things, not because they were famous or wealthy, but because they cared about others and were willing to take risks for what was right. Marcus found himself learning alongside his children, discovering aspects of history and humanity that his Ivy League education had somehow missed. He began to understand that there were different kinds of intelligence, different forms of wisdom, and that the woman sitting in his kitchen possessed something more valuable than any degree or certification. As the afternoon wore on, Grace shifted from history lessons to something even more profound. She began asking Emma and Ethan about their own lives, their dreams, their fears, and their questions about the world around them. But these weren't the surface-level conversations Marcus was used to having with his children during their brief encounters between his business calls. "Tell me something," Grace said, closing the handmade book and giving both children her full attention. "When you think about the future, when you imagine yourselves all grown up, what do you see?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, twisting a strand of her blonde hair around her finger. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to help people, but I don't know how." Grace leaned forward, her expression serious and encouraging. "What kind of people would you want to help, sweetheart?" "Kids who don't have nice homes like ours. Kids who are sad or scared." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Sometimes I feel sad too, even though Daddy says I have everything I could want." "Does that make me ungrateful?" Marcus felt his heart break a little. His daughter, surrounded by luxury and privilege, was struggling with emotions he had never taken the time to notice, let alone address. He had assumed that providing for her material needs was enough, that happiness would naturally follow from having the best of everything. Grace reached across the counter and took Emma's small hand in her larger one. "Oh, honey, having feelings isn't about being grateful or ungrateful. It's about being human. You can have a beautiful home and still feel lonely sometimes. You can have every toy in the world and still wish for something different. That doesn't make you bad or wrong. It makes you real." Ethan, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "I feel lonely too. Even when I'm with other kids at school, I feel like they don't really know me, like they only like me because of our big house and the cool stuff we have." Grace nodded knowingly. "That's a heavy feeling to carry, isn't it? Wondering if people care about who you are inside." Not just what you have on the outside. Both children nodded, and Marcus realized that his efforts to give them the best of everything had somehow left them feeling isolated and unsure of their own worth. They had been surrounded by people who were paid to care for them, educated by teachers who saw them as products to be perfected, and socialized with children from similar backgrounds who understood privilege but not struggle. You know what I think? Grace continued. I think both of you have something very special inside you. Emma, that desire to help others, that's called compassion, and it's one of the most important qualities a person can have. And Ethan, recognizing that real friendship is about more than money or things, that shows wisdom. She paused, looking at both children with genuine affection. But here's something I want you to understand. Having privilege, having advantages that other people don't have, that doesn't make you bad people. What matters is what you do with those advantages. Grace stood up and walked to the large windows that overlooked the sprawling grounds of the Thompson estate. The gardens were perfectly manicured, the pool sparkled in the afternoon sun, and beyond the gates, the city of Los Angeles stretched out below them. Look out there, she said, gesturing to the view. This is a beautiful home, and you're very fortunate to live here. But fortune comes with responsibility. The question isn't whether you deserve what you have. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Emma joined Grace at the window. What do you mean? Well, Grace said thoughtfully, remember that story I told you about my great-great-grandmother? She used her ability to read and write to teach other people. She took something she had learned and shared it with others who needed it. That's how privilege becomes powerful in a good way. Marcus watched as his daughter's face lit up with understanding. For the first time, someone was helping her see that her advantages weren't something to feel guilty about, but rather tools she could use to make a difference in the world. So if I wanted to help kids who don't have nice homes, Emma said slowly, working through the idea, I could use our resources to do that? Exactly, Grace smiled. Maybe you could learn about organizations that help children in need. Maybe you could volunteer your time or organize fundraisers, or simply use your voice to speak up for kids who don't have anyone to speak for them. Ethan had joined them at the window now, looking out at the world beyond their gates with new eyes. But how do we learn about those things? At school, we mostly just study math and science and reading. Grace turned back to face both children. That's where curiosity comes in. Learning doesn't stop when you leave the classroom. The most important education happens when you start asking questions about the world around you and then going out to find the answers. She walked back to the counter and gathered up the photographs and books she had brought. These stories I shared with you today, I didn't learn them in school. I learned them from my family, from books I found in libraries, from talking to people who had lived through these experiences. Real learning is about being curious enough to seek out the stories that don't get told in textbooks. Marcus felt a growing sense of urgency as he listened. His children were hungry for this kind of authentic learning, this connection to the wider world and its complexities. Yet their carefully structured lives left little room for exploration or genuine discovery. Grace sat back down and looked at both children seriously. I want to give you an assignment if you're willing to take it on. Both Emma and Ethan nodded eagerly. I want you to start paying attention to the world around you in a new way. When you see someone working in your school, in a restaurant, in a store, I want you to remember that they have stories too. They have families, dreams, challenges, and victories. I want you to practice seeing people as complete human beings, not just as the jobs they do or the services they provide. She pulled 2 small notebooks from her bag, simple spiral-bound books that looked almost shabby compared to the expensive planners and devices the children usually used. These are for you to write down your observations, your questions, your thoughts about the world. Not for grades, not for anyone else to read unless you want to share. Just for you, to help you remember what you're learning about life. Emma took her notebook reverently, running her fingers over the plain cover. No one's ever given me homework like this before. Because this isn't homework, Grace said with a gentle smile. This is life work. This is the kind of learning that will stay with you forever, long after you've forgotten most of what you memorized for tests. As the evening approached, Grace began to gather her things, but not before sharing one final story that would change how Marcus saw both his children and himself. She sat back down and opened her worn canvas bag one more time, pulling out a letter that looked like it had been read hundreds of times. This, she said, holding the letter carefully, was written by a young man named David. He was 12 years old when he wrote it. Just a little older than you two. Both children leaned forward, curious about this new story. David lived in a very poor neighborhood. His school didn't have enough books, the building was falling apart, and many of his teachers had given up trying to help the students learn. Most people looked at kids like David and assumed they wouldn't amount to much. Grace unfolded the letter carefully, but David had something special. He had a dream, and he had adults in his life who believed in him. This letter was written to a wealthy businessman who lived in a mansion, not unlike this one. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he realized where this story might be heading. In this letter, David didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for toys or games or anything for himself. Instead, he asked this businessman to come visit his school, to see what the students were capable of when someone took the time to believe in them. Emma's eyes were wide. "Did the businessman come?" Grace nodded slowly. He did, and what he found surprised him. These children, despite having so little, had ideas that could change the world. They had thought about problems in their community and come up with solutions that even highly educated adults hadn't considered. She looked directly at both children. The businessman realized that he had been living in a bubble, surrounded by people who thought just like him, who had the same advantages he did. He had never considered that some of the most important wisdom might come from people who had faced challenges he couldn't even imagine. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What happened to David?" David grew up to become a teacher, just like that businessman hoped he would. But more than that, he created programs that brought together children from different backgrounds, different neighborhoods, different experiences. He helped rich kids and poor kids learn from each other. Grace refolded the letter carefully. The businessman learned something important from David's letter. He learned that privilege isn't just about having nice things. It's about having the power to open doors, to create opportunities, to bring people together who might never have met otherwise. Marcus felt as if Grace was speaking directly to him, as if she somehow knew he was listening from the doorway. He thought about all the boards he served on, all the charitable donations he made, all the ways he tried to give back to society. But how much of that was really about making a difference? And how much was about making himself feel better about his wealth? "I want to tell you something important," Grace continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Both of you are going to inherit more than just money someday. You're going to inherit the power to make choices about what kind of world you want to live in." She stood up and walked around the kitchen island, sitting closer to the children. "Right now, you go to school with other children who have the same advantages you do. You live in a neighborhood where everyone has big houses and nice cars. That's not bad, but it means you're only seeing one small piece of what the world is really like." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Like we're only seeing one color in the garden you talked about." "Exactly," Grace smiled approvingly. "And here's what I want you to understand. The world needs people like you, people who have been given advantages, to use those advantages to build bridges, to bring different groups of people together, to make sure that kids like David have the same opportunities that you take for granted." She pulled out her phone and showed them a photograph of a group of children working together on what appeared to be a science project. The kids were clearly from different backgrounds, different races, different economic situations, but they were all focused intently on their work. "This is a program I help run on weekends. Children from private schools like yours work alongside children from public schools, children from families who are struggling financially, children who are facing challenges you've never had to think about." Ethan studied the photograph carefully. "They look like they're having fun." "They are," Grace confirmed. "Because when children work together on something meaningful, when they're solving real problems instead of just memorizing information for tests, learning becomes exciting. They teach each other things that no textbook could ever contain." Marcus thought about his own education, his rise to success, and realized that some of his most valuable lessons had come from people who had very different backgrounds from his own. His first business partner had grown up in poverty and brought a scrappy, resourceful perspective that had been crucial to their early success. His most trusted advisor had immigrated to the country with nothing and understood risk in ways that Marcus, who had always had a safety net, never could. Grace gathered the children around her for what seemed like a final lesson. "I want to leave you with a challenge," she said. "Not homework from school, but a real-world challenge that could change your lives." Both children sat up straighter, sensing the importance of what was coming. I want you to find ways to step outside your comfortable world and learn from people who are different from you. Maybe it's volunteering at a community center, or participating in programs that bring different kinds of kids together, or simply paying attention to the people who work in places you go every day. She looked at Emma first. You said you want to help children who don't have nice homes like yours. The first step is getting to know those children, understanding what their lives are really like, learning what kind of help would actually make a difference. Then she turned to Ethan. And you said you feel lonely even when you're surrounded by other kids. Maybe what you're missing is the chance to form real friendships based on shared interests and values, not just shared circumstances. Grace stood up and shouldered her canvas bag. The most important thing I can teach you is this. Your worth as a person isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give. Not just money or things, but your time, your attention, your willingness to listen and learn from others. As she prepared to leave, both children seemed reluctant to let her go. They had experienced something they had never felt before, being seen and heard as complete human beings, being challenged to think beyond themselves, being trusted with real responsibility. Will we see you again? Emma asked, her voice small and hopeful. Grace smiled, and there was something mysterious in her expression. That depends on what you do with what you've learned today. The world has a way of bringing together people who are ready to learn from each other. After Grace left, Marcus remained hidden in the hallway for several more minutes, watching his children. They sat quietly at the kitchen counter, each holding their simple notebooks, their faces showing a mixture of excitement and contemplation that he had never seen before. Finally, he took a deep breath and stepped into the room. Dad, Emma looked up, startled. When did you get home? A little while ago, Marcus said honestly, his voice softer than usual. I heard you talking with someone. Who was that? Miss Grace, Ethan said immediately. She was the best babysitter ever. She taught us about history, and about people, and about how to see the world differently. Marcus sat down on the stool where Grace had been sitting, trying to process everything he had witnessed. What did she teach you? For the next hour, his children told him about everything they had learned. They showed him the notebooks Grace had given them, explaining the assignment to observe the world around them with new eyes. They talked about privilege and responsibility, about the importance of learning from people who were different from them, about using their advantages to help others rather than just accumulating more for themselves. As Marcus listened, he realized that in a single afternoon, a woman he had never met had given his children something he had been trying to provide for years, a sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than themselves, and the tools to become genuinely caring human beings. She sounds like an amazing teacher, Marcus said when they finished. I'm sorry I missed meeting her. She said something interesting about you, Dad, Emma said, looking at her notebook thoughtfully. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What did she say? She said that sometimes parents who work very hard to give their children everything forget to give them the most important thing of all. Which is? Themselves, Ethan answered. She said that children need their parents to share their stories, their values, their real selves. Not just their money or their achievements. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had spent years providing for his children, but how much of himself had he actually shared with them? They knew he was successful, but did they know who he was as a person? Did they know what he valued, what he had learned from his failures, what truly mattered to him? Over the following days, Marcus found himself thinking constantly about what he had witnessed. He canceled several business trips and rearranged his schedule to spend more time at home. But more importantly, he began to see his children differently, and they began to see him differently too. He started having real conversations with Emma and Ethan, not just checking in on their homework or activities, but asking them about their thoughts, their dreams, their questions about the world. He shared stories from his own childhood, including the struggles his family had faced when he was young, stories he had never thought to tell them before. Marcus also began researching the community programs Grace had mentioned. He discovered a whole network of organizations working to bring together children from different backgrounds, to provide educational opportunities for underprivileged kids, to create the kind of bridges that Grace had described. But as he learned more about these programs, Marcus realized that simply writing checks wouldn't be enough. His children needed to be involved, needed to experience firsthand what it meant to step outside their comfortable world and learn from people whose experiences were different from their own. 3 weeks after Grace's visit, Marcus made a decision that would change their family forever. He enrolled Emma and Ethan in a weekend program that brought together children from across the city to work on community service projects. The program was exactly what Grace had described. Kids from private schools working alongside kids from public schools. Children from wealthy families collaborating with children whose families were struggling economically. The first Saturday morning, as they drove to the community center in a part of the city his children had never seen before, Marcus felt nervous. These weren't the carefully controlled environments he was used to. This was real life, messy and unpredictable and authentic. But as he watched his children that first day, he saw something remarkable happen. Initially shy and uncertain, Emma and Ethan gradually began to connect with the other children. They discovered that despite their different backgrounds, they shared common interests, common concerns, and common dreams. Emma found herself working with a girl named Maria, whose family had immigrated from Guatemala. Maria spoke 3 languages and had a deep understanding of different cultures that fascinated Emma. Together, they designed a program to help refugee children adjust to their new schools. Ethan partnered with a boy named Jerome, whose father worked 2 jobs to support their family. Jerome had a natural talent for problem solving and had invented several clever devices to make life easier in their small apartment. The boys began working together on projects that combined Ethan's access to resources with Jerome's innovative thinking. As the weeks passed, Marcus realized that his children were learning lessons that no amount of money could buy. They were developing genuine friendships based on mutual respect and shared values. They were gaining confidence in their ability to make a real difference in the world. Most importantly, they were discovering their own authentic selves, separate from their material advantages. The program also changed Marcus himself. As he volunteered alongside his children, he met parents from all walks of life who were dealing with challenges he had never considered. He began to understand that success came in many forms, and that some of the most admirable people he met were those who were raising loving, responsible children despite facing significant obstacles. One evening, as they drove home from the community center, Emma made an observation that stopped Marcus in his tracks. "Dad, do you think Miss Grace knew this would happen?" "What do you mean?" "Do you think she knew that teaching us about privilege and responsibility would change our whole family? Do you think she knew we would end up here, working with kids like Maria and Jerome?" Marcus considered the question carefully. He had been wondering the same thing himself. Grace had seemed to know exactly what his children needed to hear, had given them exactly the tools they needed to grow into more complete human beings. "I think," he said slowly, "that Miss Grace understood something about learning that most people miss. Real education isn't about memorizing facts or getting good grades. It's about becoming the kind of person who can see clearly, think deeply, and care genuinely about others." Ethan nodded from the back seat. "She said the most important learning happens when we step outside our comfort zones and let other people teach us. And that's exactly what we've been doing," Marcus realized. "All of us." 6 months after Grace's visit, the Thompson family had transformed in ways that Marcus could never have imagined. The house was still beautiful, the grounds still perfectly maintained, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Instead of feeling like a museum showcasing Marcus's success, it had become a genuine home where real conversations happened and meaningful relationships were built. Emma had started a nonprofit organization, with Marcus's guidance but driven by her own passion, that paired children from privileged backgrounds with refugee families to help them navigate the American school system. She had learned to speak basic Spanish and was working on learning Mandarin so she could communicate with more of the families they served. Ethan had discovered a talent for engineering and was working with Jerome and several other kids from the community, programmed to design low-cost solutions for problems they had identified in underserved neighborhoods. Their latest project was a water filtration system that could be built from readily available materials. But the most significant change was in Marcus himself. He had begun restructuring his business practices to create more opportunities for people from diverse backgrounds. He established scholarship programs, mentorship initiatives, and internship opportunities specifically designed to identify and nurture talent that might otherwise be overlooked. More importantly, He had learned to listen to perspectives that challenged his assumptions and made his company stronger. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. There were board members who questioned his new priorities, colleagues who didn't understand why he was spending time on community programs instead of focusing solely on profit margins. Some of his wealthy neighbors raised eyebrows when children from the inner city started visiting the Thompson house regularly for study, groups and project meetings, but Marcus had discovered something that all his previous success couldn't provide: a sense of genuine fulfillment. He was finally using his resources and influence in ways that aligned with his deepest values, values that he had buried under years of relentless ambition and material accumulation. The most profound moment came on a Saturday evening in late spring. The family was hosting a dinner for all the families involved in Emma's nonprofit program. The formal dining room that had once hosted business associates and social climbers was now filled with families from Guatemala, Somalia, Syria, and Honduras, alongside families from Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach. As Marcus looked around the table, listening to conversations in multiple languages, watching children who had never seen each other's worlds just months before now, planning summer projects together, he felt a presence that seemed familiar. He turned toward the kitchen doorway and froze. Grace Washington stood there, wearing the same simple blue dress, the same comfortable shoes, the same regal bearing that had captivated his children 6 months earlier. But this time she was smiling directly at him. "Miss Grace." Emma and Ethan jumped up simultaneously, rushing to embrace the woman who had changed their lives. "Hello, my dear ones," Grace said warmly, hugging both children. "I heard about all the wonderful work you've been doing." Marcus stood slowly, his heart pounding as he realized that this couldn't be a coincidence. "How did you know to come here tonight?" Grace's eyes twinkled with the same mysterious wisdom he remembered from that day when he had listened from the hallway. "Mr. Thompson, I've been following your family's journey with great interest. When children truly embrace the lessons they're meant to learn, it creates ripples that spread far beyond what anyone expects." As the evening continued, Grace moved through the gathering like someone who belonged there, speaking easily with parents in their native languages, encouraging the children in their projects, and somehow making everyone feel valued and heard. Marcus watched in amazement as she connected with each family, drawing out their stories and helping them see their own strength and wisdom. Later, after the other families had left and his children had gone to bed, Marcus found Grace sitting in his study, looking at the family photographs on his desk. For the first time, they were alone together. "I owe you an enormous debt," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her. "You saved my family." Grace shook her head gently. "I didn't save anyone, Mr. Thompson. I simply helped your children see what was already inside them. The capacity for empathy, for growth, for genuine connection with others. Those qualities were there all along. But how did you know?" Marcus asked. "How did you know exactly what they needed to hear?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "I've been working with families for over 30 years. Wealthy families, poor families, families caught somewhere in between. What I've learned is that privilege without purpose creates isolation. Success without service creates emptiness. Your children were drowning in advantages but starving for meaning." She turned to look at him directly. "But they weren't the only ones who needed saving, were they?" Marcus felt tears prick his eyes as he nodded. "I had everything I thought I wanted, but I had lost touch with everything that actually mattered. My children barely knew me, and I didn't really know them either." "The beautiful thing about children," Grace said softly, "is that they're natural teachers. When we give them opportunities to grow, they show us how to grow too. When we help them find their purpose, they help us remember our own." She stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the grounds where, just hours earlier, children from around the world had been playing together under the California stars. "Your children asked me once if they would see me again," Grace said. "I told them it would depend on what they did with what they learned. Tonight I have my answer." Marcus joined her at the window. "Will they see you again?" Grace smiled, and in that smile was the satisfaction of a teacher whose students had exceeded every expectation. "Mr. Thompson, your children have learned the most important lesson there is, that true wealth comes from lifting others up, that real success is measured by the positive impact we have on the world around us. They don't need me anymore. They have become the teachers now." As Grace prepared to leave, she handed Marcus a small wrapped package. "This is for your family," she said simply. Inside was a handmade book, similar to the one she had shown Emma and Ethan that first day, but this one was blank, its pages waiting to be filled. Every family needs to record its own story, Grace explained. Not just the achievements and acquisitions, but the moments of growth, the lessons learned, the connections made with others. Your real story is just beginning. Marcus watched from his front steps as Grace walked down the long driveway toward the street. A simple black sedan waited for her, and as she reached for the door handle, she turned back one final time. "Remember," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the evening air, "the best teachers are often the ones we least expect, and the most important lessons are usually learned outside the classroom." As the car disappeared into the night, Marcus realized that he would probably never see Grace Washington again. But her impact on his family would last forever. She had taught them that privilege was not something to feel guilty about, but rather a tool to be used wisely. She had shown them that true education happened when people from different worlds came together to learn from each other. Most importantly, she had reminded them that the most valuable inheritance they could give to the next generation wasn't money or property or social status. It was the understanding that every person has worth, every story has value, and every life has the potential to make a difference in the world. The blank book Grace had left behind would be filled with the stories of their continuing journey, the families they would meet, the bridges they would build, and the lessons they would both teach and learn. It would become a testament to the truth that Grace had known all along, that when we open our hearts and minds to others, we don't just change their lives, we transform our own.